Welcome, traveller, to my corner of the internet. If you've come here from the podcast, you know why you're here. Feel free to skip ahead to the content. For everyone else, Australia needs to talk more about nuclear power and really nuclear technology in general, because despite its rough history, it's an integral part of supporting our everyday lives, and I'm prepared to wager that people actually want to talk about this. So I started a podcast. I'd love for you to go and check it out. The pilot episode of my podcast is an interview with Dr. Ben Hurd, Australia's leading nuclear power advocate, and it went really well. This is the full, unedited, warts and all version of my pilot episode, with video. I'm uploading this for two reasons. The original episode was 2 hours, which is just too long for a podcast. Having said that, everything that we covered was great, and I think making it available is the right thing to do. Secondly, despite its flaws, I love the capabilities the internet and platforms like YouTube offer to the individual when it comes to discussion of hard topics. I think we all do. I plan to never turn off comments because there's always a few chunks of gold to be found there. I simply encourage everyone that if you wouldn't say something to a person's face, you wouldn't post it here. Extending from that, by all means, within the rules of the DMCA, share, comment, re-upload, critique. That's what this is for. Just a note before we begin. I was very nervous when recording this, and to calm myself, I used some controlled breathing, which my microphone had no trouble recording. Hence, there's a lot of heavy breathing in the first two interviews. I promise to do better in future. In the meantime, if it helps, just pretend that I'm Australian Darth Vader. Now, with all that out of the way, welcome to the pilot YouTube video for Going Fission, Australia's nuclear technology discussion. Anyone anyway connected to the nuclear power advocacy in Australia will no doubt be familiar with my first guest. Those same people would agree that I could have asked for no one better for the pilot episode. Staunch advocate for nuclear power in Australia, founder and director of the NGO Bright New World, Dr. Ben Hurd. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Logan, and congratulations on Going Fission. It's a terrific initiative.
Thank you very much. Look, so first question I've got. You're quite a well-respected figure in the science of climate change. Where did this start for you?
That started fairly modestly. I think it's fair to say I had taken a master's in sustainability, corporate and environmental sustainability at Monash University in Victoria. And from a couple of career changes, I moved towards a climate change advisory team. And so we were doing a lot of work in climate change adaptation at that time. As I moved ahead and sort of further down my story, I got very well acquainted with Professor Barry Brook here in Adelaide, who was doing a lot of really terrific writing about climate change science, and he was doing a lot of outreach about climate change science as well. And I was certainly getting very, very frustrated with the continual denialism in climate change science that I was seeing so much of sort of around this 2006 to 2010 period. It was something that I felt very, very strongly about. And I didn't have the ability to do the original climate change science work. You know, that was well outside of my remit. But I did have the ability to communicate what I had learnt and what I had understood to a broad range of audiences, which sort of then, you know, also included doing some lecturing and handling some units of sustainability then for Adelaide University. And so I feel like I've had a very fortunate opportunity to be a conduit for the work of some really brilliant people, including, you know, some really brilliant Australian scientists who've gone on to become my friends and supervisors. And, you know, I think in terms of the nuclear power advocacy in Australia, it has been really material that I started from that position of climate change and defending and fighting for the climate change science. You know, and if anyone wants to go back and do the archaeology at the conversation and find all of my comments, you know, from 2006 onward, you'll see that was something that I was taking very personally and very seriously, and that I felt I had a fortunate position, you know, being someone who was trying to implement and operationalize what we were learning about climate change for clients, people like the City of Melbourne or people like electricity distributors. Meant that I had an original take on what was going on, and that has been a really crucial part of my journey and something that remains part of my professional life today.
Excellent. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think earlier on you were a little bit anti-nuclear, or you were against the nuclear option. Was that accurate?
Yeah, I was staunchly anti-nuclear. Uh, I wouldn't say it was a terribly informed position. It was more of a formed position that sort of sprang out of my overall life journey. I was, and a lot of people have misunderstood this about me. I've been sometimes misattributed as a former anti-nuclear campaigner. That's not true. I wasn't leading campaigns against nuclear, but what I was someone who had come out of the Catholic Church and a Catholic upbringing, where we were very concerned with social justice and peace. So, and certainly in the 1980s and the mid 1980s, peace was a very big issue. We had communism ending. 1986 was the International Year of Peace. 1986 was also the year the Chernobyl reactor blew
Yeah.
up. And so a very legitimate peace movement that was very much tied to wanting nuclear war to become implausible for our future was a part of my upbringing. And we read National Geographic, and so that was very much a part of my upbringing as well. And so there was a very strong messaging that was coming to me. And as a young man growing up in Australia, that's the only messaging I was getting about nuclear technology whatsoever. So it was fairly logical that my default position about nuclear was going to be an unfriendly one. Now, from there, as soon as I started earning any money for myself, I was an enthusiastic environmentalist. So, no sooner did I have a job at Woolworths than, I was giving some of my money to Greenpeace and giving some of my money to the Wilderness Society, and I remained, their supporters for quite a long time. And so you can imagine then I'm embracing the message that they're bringing to me, some of which I still very strongly believe in, and part of which I've gone back and seen on the letters that I've received, which I still have filed away, was an anti-nuclear indoctrination that made sure that I thought nuclear power was the worst option. Of everything that we had in front of us, it was the worst option. And so that was true for me all the way through my Masters of Sustainability, all the way through my first few years of consulting in environmental sustainability and other projects. Nuclear power was simply anathema. And if anyone had asked my opinion, and some people did, I was very, very clear about that. Yes, I'm absolutely concerned about climate change. Nuclear power, no way. So yeah, that's absolutely what life was like for me and where I came from. It's a genuine part of the origins of how I have come to be doing what I'm doing today.
Right. Can you point to a specific light bulb moment where it switched over, or was it more a gradual coming to that conclusion or changing your opinion?
Both. There was some of both. So a couple of light bulb moments that I recall in studying sustainability. There was a French guy in one of my tutorial groups. He was actually from the island of Réunion, a little island off in the Indian Ocean somewhere. And he pretty frankly one day said, "I don't know what the hell you Australians are all doing. We should just be having," I think we were talking about transportation at the time. "We should just be running nuclear power plants and having electric cars and be done with it." And there was just something so pragmatic and simple about what
Ding.
he's, yeah, yeah, about what he said and the way he said it, that I still pushed it away, but it sort of got around my hand, if you like, went in my ear and lodged in my brain for later.
Yeah, for
So I
sure.
didn't deal with it at the time, but for later. And then, yeah, a lot of people have asked me about this transition. I was actually hoping you'd ask so I could pinpoint some of these more specific things. One of the jobs that I had to do at one point was to do with the Victorian desalination plant at Wonthaggi. And we had to, the commitment of government at the time was that this would be a quote unquote carbon neutral piece of infrastructure. And so one of my jobs in that team, I was in charge of the spreadsheet of all of the inputs of energy and materials for this plant, what that was going to mean in greenhouse gases, and how we're going to make sure that's carbon neutral. And it was just staggering. the amount of energy that was going to be needed for one desalination plant in the continent of Australia. And given what I knew about climate change and what we're probably going to need for desalination this century worldwide, and then I see the emissions per unit electricity from this brown coal in Victoria. I see the amount of brown coal down the road in the Latrobe Valley. And then I see our calculations about what this would mean for purchasing green power at the time, which was the strategy, purchasing newly developed wind infrastructure projects from the grid and using that to offset the desal plant emissions. And I was just thinking, this is madness. We would need to build a massive new amount of wind power just to offset this one new piece of essential infrastructure. If this is where we're going, like that's not even going to sort of shut down the brown coal. And that was around, look, you'd probably be able to find exactly when that is. I think that's about 2008, 2009. And, that's when I was just struggling with the numbers, and I was starting to go, where if this is what we've got by way of options for climate change, it's not just hard, we're screwed, basically. And so, and then I had another friend at the Department of Sustainability and Environment of Victoria. He had been one of my clients for some of our work there. We became good friends. He's still a good friend. Hello, Will, if you're watching. And he was someone I really respected. I fully respected his views about sustainability and the environment. And he one day quite pragmatically said, this was soon before I moved back to Adelaide, quite pragmatically said, look, I just think we should probably be using nuclear power. And at that point, I really just kind of stared at my shoes. I'd really kind of run out of strong comebacks to that. And so there were those moments along the way. And then in the downtime between those moments, there was more of that gradual process that you're talking about, where you sort of start to open yourself to more information on that topic, and it starts to get in. And that all sort of, that all came to a head about the end of 2010. And that was it. Game over.
Excellent. Really interesting. Really interesting point. No, I think it's actually interesting. I don't think energy, like how much energy, is something that people generally understand. When you flick on a light switch, it's just there's some energy. I don't really think people know how to quantify that, and I think it'd be a really good thing to possibly discuss or to look at in another video. But yeah.
Well, I think a lot of people's knowledge is based on their immediate environment and their immediate exposure. So we're all quite well exposed to household energy consumption. So a lot of people think in terms of household energy consumption. That's quite reasonable. The reality is that that's a very small fraction of actually what it takes to run a country like Australia. And I think people are becoming more and more aware of that, but it is a little hard to grasp. And the quantities are huge. The quantities are, just in existing electricity is very, very high. If you talk about hopefully transitioning maybe some other services to electricity, that rises again. If you talk about maybe using clean electricity and heat to displace things like liquid fossil fuels, which we would eventually need to do in future, it rises again. And if you talk about a global growing population, which, as I said recently in a presentation, that growth is slowing down, but it hasn't stopped yet, it rises again. So the idea that dealing with climate change with only some of the technological solutions available to us, not all of them, is a good idea, is simply not a true environmentalist's pathway, in my opinion.
True. Alrighty, so look, you walked away from sort of potential careers with some very sort of high-profile engineering companies in Australia, and you started Think Climate. Why'd you do that?
So it was partly pragmatic. It was time in my personal life to return to the city that I love, which is Adelaide. Having a young family, and so it was time to return home. That gave the opportunity to start my own consulting business, and I felt like I needed to do that because at the time, a lot of the consulting money that was available in climate change was to do with adaptation. Now, I believe in adaptation. Adaptation is something we essentially have to get on with doing. It's very, very important work, but it wasn't the work that really motivated me. I really wanted to be doing more work in the mitigation space. I really wanted to be working with companies and organizations about actually lowering their greenhouse gas emissions, not just positioning themselves to deal with the climate change that we had in the pipeline. And I wasn't really feeling like I was getting a lot of opportunities to do that. That just didn't seem to be what was going on. And so I wanted to start Think Climate to pitch that, to say, there's actually huge opportunities for you as private organizations, government organizations, NGOs, to strengthen your organization by going through a process of understanding where and how you have impacts on the environment and changing your practices. And so Think Climate gave me the opportunity to present that suite of services to the market, mostly, almost exclusively here in South Australia. And look, that just made me happy on a personal level. You know, I felt like I was getting closer to what it was I actually wanted and needed to be doing, why I had sort of got into the sustainability game in the first place. It took some time to warm up, but it eventually did. I think Climate ended up doing some really good, actually quite leading work with local government. So we had some really exceptional relationships with the city of Onkaparinga with their pursuit of carbon neutrality. We were certainly very trusted in as advisors in that role. Also with the City of Adelaide in terms of their energy efficiency program, and helping them model and understand where they could save energy. So a lot of the street lighting replacement program that the City of Adelaide has embarked upon, we had a hand in building that case for them. So I'm really, really proud of a lot of the work that we were able to do. Fringe benefit was it also gave me the personal autonomy that I felt I needed to talk about nuclear power, because I think it is a less controversial space in 2018 than it was in 2009. In 2009, and working for very large firms as a relatively junior person, I don't think there was really a lot of appetite for me to go out and have a strong opinion on that topic. And I wanted to go out and have a strong opinion on that topic because, again, that's why I got involved in the whole environmental and sustainability space in the first place, is because I felt like something needed to be said and people needed to speak up. So I think Climate was a really effective vehicle for me to do both, to work more in climate change mitigation and also to have that autonomy to speak about what I thought was the bigger unaddressed issue in Australian energy.
Yeah, definitely. It's very interesting that every time I talk to people about nuclear, it's never a boring conversation.
No,
And I
absolutely
think
not.
people really are really quite willing to have this conversation. But I think sort of at the higher, like it's just not going to happen at government level at the moment. I mean, we just got a new prime minister. What is it, our sixth one in 11 years? It's
Let's not run those numbers.
oh yeah,
It's pretty
crazy.
horrible. Look,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
true, but both of those things you've said are true. Conversations are never dull. Conversations are always available. People actually do want to talk about it, and that was something that gave me a shock in sort of 2010 when I started going public with this. Is it was not the response I expected. I expected far more rotten tomatoes being thrown in my being thrown in my direction. And instead, what I got was a hell of a lot of curiosity. Some outright support. A lot of
Mm.
people coming out really swiftly and early and saying, about time, and actually about time it was someone like you doing this, someone coming from the environmental angle doing this. And beyond that, what I got was a huge amount of curiosity. There are a lot of people out there who, and I've made this point several times, given boxes to tick on a survey, if it's yes, no, if it's a yes or no, then it's no right up to the point where it's yes, right? But there can be a lot of space between that no and that yes, which is actually unsure, which is actually curious. And there's just a huge amount of that out there, which is why the conversation is so important. And as far as politics goes, I have become increasingly convinced that there is never going to be a right time in politics. It's not going to gift that to us. The fact of the matter is, if it's the right issue, then the right time is now and always. And you just have to keep having the conversations. You cannot wait for the perfect political space to open up. That isn't going to happen. You have to influence the political space, which is one reason I'm so incredibly glad that you've put together this podcast program, Going Fission for Australia, because we need it.
I think it's just more voices. What you do is fantastic. What I've been thinking is this podcast has the potential just to reach a different crowd.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and diversification. Reaching exactly more audience, more types of audiences. everyone has a slightly different opportunity to reach slightly different segments of society because of who they are, what they've done, what their story is, and what their journey is. And that's part of what me and other people, in the various things I've done, I've enjoyed a terrific new career out of it in a sense, but it was never actually all about me. It was about trying to empower and encourage more people to do it, and that's how you get the ripple effect of conversations where you actually get social change.
Definitely. All right, let's actually talk about nuclear. Like in Australia, what roles do you think it can play? What can it do for us?
It's worth scratching the surface to understand just what puts together Australian energy at the moment. And when people in other countries ask me, so what is Australian energy made of? And I tell them it's about 68% coal and about 15% gas, they're dumbfounded. That's really, really high.
Mm.
Like on a global scale, that's really high because we are one of two nations in the OECD, I think it is, along with Italy, that don't use nuclear power, and we have very little hydroelectricity. So Australians don't realise just how fossil dependent we are. And so sitting underneath the Australian economy, chugging away, there's about 20 gigawatts of coal. That's a huge amount of coal. So we need to use nuclear power in a blended fashion with a whole lot of other technologies in order to provide ourselves with a system that's really, really deeply, deeply decarbonised and affordable and reliable. And this is this is the conversation that's being had in Australian politics for the last 12 or 18 months, right? Clean, affordable, reliable. Okay. Well, there's a technology which is demonstrated around the world to do all three. And it's the one and only technology that Australia is preventing itself from even considering. So is there a role for nuclear power in Australia? Absolutely. I mean, for so long as we're running 20 gigawatts of coal, of course there's a role. Is that role necessarily 20 gigawatts of nuclear? No, not necessarily. So there could be a great deal of rationalising in the way Australia runs its electricity infrastructure and markets that I think, is going to mean that we use a lot more variable wind and solar power. That means we are going to do a lot more with demand management. I think that's a huge area that is going to alter the way we need to operate a market. I think we are going to add new, relatively large-scale energy storage. I'm particularly interested in compressed air storage at the moment as an option. All of those things are going to play a part, and nuclear can be blended really nicely with all of those to get what we need. And I'm talking about greenhouse gas emissions of like 50 grams per kilowatt hour and under on average. If you only have a modest ambition, if you don't care, if you think 250 or 300 grams is okay, fine. Just push ahead with wind and solar and end up with the inevitable underlying body of coal and gas. And that's what we'll get. We'll get a much messier electricity market that's sort of clean, but not really. Okay, that's not really good enough. If your ambition is high, if your ambition is fundamentally full decarbonisation, even to the point where we can then use electricity to decarbonise other sectors, the role for nuclear is paramount. It's unequivocal. People, when this conversation starts, people then often push back, well, we will just use this cheap renewable electricity and storage. And there's a couple of things about that that are very important. And I was hearing a colleague of mine on the radio the other day, and he's someone I like a lot, respect a lot. He's a very smart guy, but he was emphasizing this cheap renewable energy. And what a lot of people are still missing is that a cheap kilowatt hour is a very, very different thing to an affordable system. And so these cheap kilowatt hours of wind and solar power bring a huge amount of challenges in actually getting them into the system to make an affordable system. Point one. Point two, energy storage, and this is the part that I'm glad a few people are starting to cotton onto. If we can have more energy storage on the Australian grid, it can store energy from any source. It's not trademarked to wind and solar. So if you have wind and solar in excess that's causing negative pricing, yep, you tap that off and you store it. But the thing is, if you're running a nuclear power plant at a fairly high rate day long, and then you have an overnight period where demand is lower, guess what? You can send that excess capacity to storage as well. And it can then be used the following day to lower peak. And what we are going to need to do is bring all of these technologies together into some modelling and find out what's the actual optimal combination of all of them. And that will help us get something that's really, really cost effective. Nuclear and storage works together really, really, really beautifully. And in the longer run, we need the heat. This is something that,
As in
again,
process heat?
yeah, yeah, this is just absurdly under-researched and under-attended to in climate change mitigation work. And Australia is no different to anyone. We're doing no better or worse than anyone in the world. But about a third of our energy is heat, is process heat. And then we're talking about things from about 250 degrees up to 1,000 degrees or more. That is not going to be replaced quickly and easily by wind and solar. So-called cheap wind and solar isn't going to do that. We need low carbon heat, and we need that to be able to be distributed and decentralized close to these industrial hubs where they're using it. That is an almost unfettered essential role for advanced nuclear technologies that can produce those high outlet temperatures that can service that industrial heat market, which in turn helps us make synthetic fuels and so on and so on and so on. When people argue that, we don't need nuclear in Australia, they are fundamentally and totally misunderstanding the challenge of decarbonisation. It's just so much bigger than those commentators either realise or are prepared to admit. And we need more people understanding and speaking in loud voices about just what the energy needs of this nation are, so that we can get that option on the table. And, if it's the wrong option, it won't get built. That's, people say, well, it'll be too expensive. It's like, well, the market will tell us that if that's the case, but we have to get it on the table.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I've been looking at sort of the energy, was the latest energy report for 2017, and it's something I think people often don't realize, that you've got sort of renewables, and sort of one portion of all the energy that we use is electricity generation. And that's obviously at
Right.
the moment where the renewables are going against. But then
Right.
there's a whole other section. This is all the energy that we use in terms of petrol, diesel,
Right.
all our fossil fuels that don't go to electricity, but used in transport and heating
Right.
and things like that. And it's that's not an insignificant portion of the total pool of energy that we use.
No, typically it varies a bit from nation to nation, but it's often about a third, a third, a third. We're talking about 2/3 of the economy of the energy economy that are being broadly missed in this one-eyed conversation about electricity, and it's really, really dangerous. So we need all of these technologies on the table, and I have two points of deep frustration that there is such a huge job to be done that this is not credibly framed as a competition between good low carbon energy sources. Everyone is going to get plenty of opportunity to grow in this space. It's a deeply, deeply unhelpful framing. And well, I'm so frustrated about that. I've forgotten what my other point of frustration was.
That's
But
fine.
no,
That's fine.
sorry, that's it. No, my other point of frustration is that electricity, from a technical point of view, is not hard, right? It's easy. It's being done already in other parts of the world. It's not the hard part. We're spending a hell of a lot of political and intellectual capital on the easiest part of the decarbonisation challenge, and that worries me. Because when you start talking about sort of retooling industry for zero carbon heat sources from things like advanced nuclear, or when you start talking about retooling hydrocarbon manufacture to use synthetic hydrocarbons, with recycled carbon dioxide, when you start talking about retooling to have potentially much, much larger battery powered fleets, these are so much harder. Just making clean electricity is easy, and we're wasting a hell of a lot of time getting it done. And that's a point of frustration, and I would like people to take that challenge a bit more seriously.
Definitely. All right. So tell us about a bit more. Well, you've told us a bit about Decarbonise SA. Oh, actually, no. Tell us a bit about Decarbonise SA and how that transitioned into Bright New World.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so what happened? The course of events was I was in Adelaide running Think Climate Consulting, and at about the end of 2010, I decided, okay, I'm over the line here, and I've got something I need to talk about, which is the fact that Australia needs to use nuclear power. So I went out with a slide deck and gave a presentation, and I've quipped that That first presentation had a room with 4 people in it. One of them was my wife, the other one was my dad. So it was a pretty humble beginning, right?
Nice.
But yeah, oh, nice. But fortunately, one of the other 2 people was from the local technology industry association, and she said that was really good. Would you do that? Would you do that again for us? And I said, sure. You know, thinking in the back of my head, couldn't go any worse than that first one. So you know, the only way, the only way is up. And on that occasion, I actually double teamed with Barry Brook, and
Nice.
yeah, well, you know, he was someone who I'd been reading for many, many years. His, you know, exceptional blog, and someone that I had wanted to connect with when I moved back to Adelaide, and we did. And that night we got 50 or 60 people, and the response was really, really huge. And so then I had that experience of going, gosh, something's just happened. What do I do with it? And I didn't know. But the decision that I sort of came to with the help of my wife at the time was, you know, start writing, start a blog, get these thoughts down so that people can follow this, give people somewhere that they can stay connected to you, because people really liked that. So I did, and again, Barry being such a successful blogger, he helped me kind of kick that off. And so I just started a blog, called it Decarbonise SA, Decarbonise South Australia. I was being pretty parochial at the time. Um, and you know, I was arrogant enough to basically say, I think my state can be decarbonised, and here's how I would do it. And I sort of went and looked at the power plants and said, these are the power plants. This is the amount of power we need. Okay, that's not that hard. If we were to use this approximate mix of technology, we'd get it done, wouldn't we? That was the sort of premise of it. And so Barry, you know, gave it a real kick along with his blog. And then one of my first big breakthroughs was a podcast with Rod Adams with Atomic Insight. He became an early fan of the blog. He said, "Gee, this new writer's doing something really interesting." So I was a guest on Atomic Insights, where I've now podcasted a few times. And again, it was one of those. It was sort of a follow-on from that first presentation where I was getting a good response, and I was going, "Oh, okay, there is something that needs to be done here," and so it went on. And so Decarbonise SA, it sort of became like a journal in a way, an iterative journal of my learning. Because I still didn't know all that much, let's be honest. You know, in 2010, when I knew what I thought and I'd got the basics of my knowledge, but I still had a long, 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 long way to go. And so I used the blog to sort of share what I was learning as I went to conferences and as I went to fora, as I did some more research, as I ran some more numbers. And look, it became pretty well read. And I was really proud of it. It ran for a lot of years. It got a lot of hits. It got quite a good following. Some of the blog posts in particular, some of them authored by me, but one actually authored by Bright New World's new general manager, you know, became really quite influential. And I'm really, really proud of that. And then you sort of have that experience where you think maybe you're butting up against a ceiling. And sometimes part of the trick is knowing when to end something. And I was starting to get the sense that it might be time to bring Decarbonise SA to an end because something else needed to start. It was good, it was loyal, it had a loyal following, but it still wasn't an organisation. You know, it was a blog. It was somewhere where people could come and engage with me and enjoy my writing, but that's not the same thing as an organisation that's actually here to do a job. And so particularly sort of as the South Australian Royal Commission came to a close in really disappointing fashion, with a citizens' jury in South Australia being quite ruthlessly gamed by really unethical conduct from other NGOs here in South Australia. And I have absolutely no hesitation in making those claims. It was dealt fatal blows by really, really disgusting conduct. And I realised that there was no voice in the space that could compete, basically. If you were having any process to have this conversation, there was no civil society voice, there was no environmental organisation saying we represent these values as well, but we disagree on this key point. And so that's when I and some others were thinking, okay, well, we need an organisation. And so I wrapped up Decarbonise SA, And I put together a business plan with my friend Dane Eckerman, and with the help of Alex Eckerman, his brother, and with some advice from Oscar Archer, another advisor to us. And I went out and hassled some people I knew in Adelaide for some funding. And I said, okay, here's some money I'm going to put into the pot. And it was a lot of money for me at that point in time. But I said to these people, if I put this much of my own money in this, would you match this? And if I raise this much, will you all commit to putting it in, and I will start this? And we got there, and we did, and so we did start it. And I was pleased that almost immediately, very quickly, we sort of got the requisite number of members to be a properly incorporated NGO. I got some pro bono legal work in Adelaide to give us a proper legal constitution. I established a board because, again, this wasn't meant to be about me. This was meant to be about an organisation that will outlive me and will do this job for the sort of people in Australia who want and need that type of organisation. And it's hard because when you finish something that's going well, Decarbonise SA was going perfectly well, and then you try to start something new, you go through a bit of a dip. You go off ending something that was going fine, starting something new, and you're not sure whether it's kind of going to go fine or well or not. So everything turned into a real milestone, and we're coming up close to 2 years now. I'm really, really proud of that. It's a very small organisation. Our resourcing is really slim, so we have to be really selective about what we do. But I think we've been very clever in the things we've chosen to do, making submissions to important processes, showing up, being in the game, representing the values of our members in this space. And, we worked hard on our branding. We worked hard on the characteristics of our voice. We worked hard on creating a message and a vision that we thought was really different, that we thought was appropriate for this century rather than something that was born in the 1960s, which is where most of our contemporary environmental organisations were born. We needed something that was born in the early 21st century and was reflecting those challenges. And I think we've succeeded in achieving those things. We've still got a long way to go in terms of becoming a stronger force in Australia. And I'm confident, particularly now with some leadership changeover, with Dane Eckerman as our new general manager, that we're going to encounter a new, exciting period for Bright New World where we really do that, where we really fill that role for Australians who need that different type of voice in the environmental space.
It sounds like it's been very much a first of a kind project.
Certainly was for me.
Yeah, but even for Australia, there's no other NGO quite like it in Australia, and I wouldn't want to say worldwide, but
we don't have.
Think there'd be so many.
No, we don't have any contemporaries in Australia in quite this sense. I mean, there are other organisations that are supportive of nuclear technology. Oh, yeah. In the way that we are incorporated and designed and the job we've set out to do. No, we're one of a kind in Australia, and we're part of a small and I would say pretty close-knit family worldwide. And organisations like Generation Atomic, Environmental Progress, Energy for Humanity. We are a tight knit group of people who are really out there in front in our respective jurisdictions, and it's a difficult place to be. And so we all really need to provide each other with moral and material support as we go along. But it's essential. Someone has to do it.
I think it kind of mirrors the technical side of the nuclear industry in that it is a small industry. It is actually quite a small industry, but it's really filled with some very switched on people.
Yes, it is. And I think it also mirrors the technical side of the nuclear industry in that to a certain degree we succeed and fail together.
Oh,
so,
yeah, sure.
There's every time our contemporaries in Finland, the United States, Europe, Britain, Africa have a win, it's a win for us all to celebrate. And, we are really trying to hold up the Australian end and then contribute in the international space when we get the opportunities, which do come up. And every win is a win for everybody. And I think that's the same in the nuclear industry itself. They are not successful and mature enough yet that they can, think in competitive terms the way, Volkswagen might think of themselves in competition with Hyundai. It's not like that really for nuclear. It's still an industry that succeeds or fails together. And so, I think everyone who's stepping out there to be an advocate has a certain level of responsibility in that how you perform sort of reflects the sector as a whole.
This isn't making me feel any more comfortable about it.
Yeah, no pressure, champ.
No pressure whatsoever. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, eh?
Yeah, indeed.
All right, so what does Bright New World have sort of a specific goal, or is it more broadly focused?
Yeah, well, good question, and thanks for asking. Yes, we set early specific goals relating to pure advocacy. I mean, we aren't like an NGO that can say we're going to run a campaign for the glossy black cockatoo and we are going to revegetate these areas with these species to get this outcome, right? We can't build nuclear power, right? That's we're never going to be someone who actually delivers the nuclear power plant, right? But we have to advocate. So we've set ourselves up with to be a clear, loud, strong voice to advocate for the use of these technologies, but most importantly, to do that in a way that we demonstrate the values alignment. So we demonstrate really clearly why we are advocating for these technologies. And that comes back to the broader vision that Bright New World's trying to articulate. What's the point? Why are we actually wanting to use these technologies? Well, it's not because we just love splitting atoms. I mean, some people do.
It is very cool.
Well, I'm sure. I expect it is. Never wouldn't know. Never done it. It's because we want a brighter world. And we've tried to define what we think that brighter world is. And we think it's a world where poverty is continuing to plunge, where conservation is actually rebounding, where we are rewilding the world, where we're not just holding back the forces of hell, we're actually making a better, more awesome planet for everybody. And because so much of that comes back to energy, we feel like we can paint a compelling vision. We also set out with a couple of more policy goals. We're really interested in the bias in international lending. I find it very distressing that multinational banks won't lend for nuclear power projects. It's one of these institutional biases that lead to nuclear underperforming at a global level. And so when people say, oh, nuclear is no good, it's not growing fast enough, it's really important to look under that and say, what are the institutional barriers to this technology? And they need to be broken down. And I'm pleased now that with our new general manager, Dane Eckerman, he is helping to articulate a slightly better, broader vision of eco-modernism and helping us find a couple more pillars of what the Bright New World vision is. And if you were to watch one of my recent presentations where I talk about my great-grandmother, and I begin with her story, and I finish, again, aligning what this better, brighter world is meant to be. Dane is helping us bring more of that as policy pillars as well, including recycling, better, deeper, more comprehensive recycling and waste management, which is just an absolutely vital topic. Rewilding, I've been expressing these values through our newsletter from day one, looking for these good news stories about how we are restoring species around the world. And so Bright New World sees great potential to partner with a lot of true, pure conservation organisations that aren't using conservation as a smokescreen for anti-nuclear advocacy, like the Conservation Council of South Australia, that just is incredibly irresponsible. They have a clear remit in conservation and they abuse it by wading into a space which actually has nothing to do with their mission. Well, fortunately, there are other conservation organisations that aren't like that, because that's what Bright New World is about. It's about bringing down greenhouse gas emissions, but also bringing up human welfare, bringing up the restoration of nature, bringing down the impacts of our materials consumption. It's about bringing that together into a vision, and it's a vision in a space that has been termed eco-modernism. I'm a big fan of the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, a document that I think is imperfect but very powerful. And I know a lot of the authors, and I'm really proud to identify as an eco-modernist. And so we are trying to bring that eco-modern vision to Australia and help Australians see what sort of a country we could have, and help people in the world see what sort of a world we could have if we were to do these things. As I say, we're young, and this is a growth process for us, but I'm very excited about the next 12 months. And I would say, I'll make the plug early in the podcast if I may.
Go for it.
It's hard to get people to sign on. The people that support Bright New World are unbelievably loyal. They are the most amazing group of people, but we do get a lot of great feedback and surprisingly little bump. So I would say to anyone who's listening that I think that sounds exciting. I think that sounds interesting. I would say, we offer a supporter plan that starts at $5 a month. And the $5 helps, but what helps even more is knowing that you're part of us. Knowing that you're part of that effort. It really helps us articulate what we're doing and explain to other stakeholders that we're a meaningful part of the conversation now. So if you think it's interesting and worth supporting, actually please go that next step and support it, because that is essential. It's not, we're not flooded with support. We're not flooded with members all day long. It's a slow process to growth, and we need people to come together so we can have a credible voice in the space.
Excellent. Look, for people that sort of might have just stumbled on this podcast, what's 140A?
One of the cleverest pieces of anti-nuclear legislation in the world. Okay. Again, many Australians, let alone people in other countries, are not aware that it is not merely that Australia does not use nuclear power. Australia has legal instruments in place that prevent us from being able to use nuclear power. And one of the most important of those legal instruments is Section 140A of, quite ironically, the Environmental Biodiversity and Conservation Act. And that section states that the minister in charge of that act may not approve certain actions. And listed in those actions is a nuclear power plant. Now, the way the Environmental Biodiversity Conservation Act works is that certain actions will automatically trigger that act. They are listed. If you are to try to do such and such a type of project in Australia, you will need to pass through the Environmental Biodiversity and Conservation Act. Certain other projects will be assessed and maybe said, yes, you do need to go through this act, or no, you don't. A nuclear power plant is a non-starter. It doesn't matter how good the argument for the nuclear power plant is in terms of environmental biodiversity and conservation. It doesn't matter. The minister may not approve it. And I have facetiously quipped, that you could propose a koala burning energy factory. Say koalas are an awesome source of energy. Yeah, we probably don't want to burn them, but look, on balance, it's actually better for the environment if we do, right? Yeah, it's not going to get up, right? The minister won't approve that, but he's at least allowed to think about it.
Watch out for those eucalyptus emissions.
Right, totally, right? He's allowed to think about it. It's an absurd proposition, but he's not ruled out from at least giving it the good grace of saying, look, I've looked at your absurd proposition. It's absurd and I'm not going to approve it. It doesn't matter how good the nuclear proposition is. It cannot be assessed by the minister. Now, that means that a company like NuScale Power or Moltex or Starcore or Terrestrial Energy or Thorcon or who are the guys that make the little nuclear battery? Oklo?
Oh, yep.
One of these extraordinary companies that are bringing extraordinary products to market. Small modular reactors, liquid-fueled reactors, load following, inherently safe, unbelievably nimble, low impact on the environment, low land use, zero greenhouse gas emissions, incredible fuel efficiency. They can't even be considered in Australia. And knowing that, they don't even bother to market themselves here because it's pointless. How are they to convince? How are they to convince their board to come to Australia to try to convince the board of, say, AGL that they are the correct investment in AGL's energy portfolio? Well, they can't make that case. And that's really distressing. And that's why I say it's one of the cleverest pieces of anti-nuclear legislation worldwide. It has, because it's created a vicious circle of silence where we end up with no conversation about nuclear because no one is here to either sell it to us, and there's no one in Australia actively making or considering the business case. It's an incredibly effective conspiracy of silence. And so at some point, we need someone to stand up and say, removing this legislation does not mean we are going to build nuclear power plants. There's so much more that would need to happen before that can happen. But at least removing that legislation means someone can come here and make the case. And so anyone that wants to knock on the door of a politician about nuclear power in Australia can say, we need to amend that legislation. It is not serving us. It's not serving us now and in the future as we're going through a massive energy transition. To have completely locked out this whole family of technologies, this is not serving us.
Yeah, it's something I've kind of noticed. I mean, it's often whenever sort of nuclear comes up, whenever it does, sort of in the media or whatnot, it seems to be today that the biggest argument against it is the price. It's going
Right.
to be too expensive. And I think, okay, fine. If that's the case, repeal 140A, let it compete in the free market.
Exactly. It's the best
Why do you need
demonstration
the?
that,
Mm.
yeah,
So
the
yeah,
best possible demonstration that that argument is true is to have them not built in a free market. And it's one area where I'm prepared to give Simon Holmes a court credit. He's another energy commentator in Australia, and I disagree with a lot more of what Simon says than I agree with. But he at least has the honesty to say, look, the legislation shouldn't be there. I don't. He says I don't think nuclear power will be built in Australia. I just don't think it will. But the legislation shouldn't be there. So he's confident enough in his position that he's prepared to say that. And that's exactly right. That's exactly the way it should be. And it'd be like outlawing a Lamborghini. I mean, I'm not going to bloody buy one. I can't afford it. But, I don't, I don't need the government to tell me I'm not allowed to buy one. And well, frankly, I happen to also think it's incorrect. I mean, in Australia, we have a real bias to look towards the United States and Western Europe in terms of our data. We just have a bias towards the English-speaking world and the Western European world. And in terms of what we would do in nuclear, that's actually not a very good analog for Australia. America is going to have limited competition in who builds its nuclear power plants because they take it as a sovereign issue. They're going to want American companies to do it. The French are going to want French companies to do it. We are not in that position. We don't have that sort of tribal loyalty to a domestic nuclear industry. We would do a global open tender in exactly the same way that the United Arab Emirates did, where they got an extraordinary product from South Korea that's been delivered at an amazing price on time, which is actually how we built the Opal reactor in Australia. The Opal research reactor was built through open global tender. There were 4 bidders, and the surprise winner was INVAP from Argentina. They were not expected to win that bid, but Australia awarded it to INVAP because it was the best bid. They designed a purpose reactor for our needs, and it is a spectacularly successful piece of infrastructure. So I really don't think Australia understands what nuclear can do for it, precisely because we've put these obstacles in our way. I am confident that if we were to run open global tenders, we would get several of the global suppliers really sharpening their pencils and really showing us what nuclear power can do. Probably the only bit of government intervention that might be worthwhile would be low-cost lending, helping to have a weighted average cost of capital of, say, 5% or 7% rather than commercial returns of 10, 11, 12, which is really suitable when you're talking about assets that are going to last for 60 or 80 years, that we have those relatively low lending rates so that those benefits in 60 or 80 years have some semblance of value. That's all you need, and you could make those lending rates available to any low carbon technology. I'm not saying that should only be available to nuclear. I think that's the role for government. If we have an intergenerational challenge like climate change, where we need to get this clean electricity infrastructure up and built, I think it's a straightforward job for government to make the cost of borrowing money relatively low, because we have to crack on with doing the job. If we did those two things, I have no qualms about saying let nuclear win or lose in those situations. No qualms whatsoever. That's the sort of situation that we should be fighting for.
it's indeed, this actually already happened in Australia. The Jarvis Bay proposal, it was, I think the leading tender was supposed to be Westinghouse, and ultimately the only thing that stopped it was a change in prime ministership. Who was, John Gorton was all for it, and Prime Minister McMahon was just dead against it.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with the story of Jarvis Bay. I mean, I absolutely believe that, and I look at it now in retrospect and go, even if it were the only plant Australia built, even if we only built one, at least we would have diversified at least that much. And now picking it up and doing more when we see the way the world is having to go would just be that much easier. It's a real
100%.
shame. Yeah, and that's where no, let me correct that, very deliberately correct that. The anti-nuclear movement understands that this is a war of attrition. They understand that every victory, no matter how big or how small, counts. Every incremental step in the direction they want counts. And that's where we haven't done a good enough job, and that's where Bright New World tries to do a better job by making submissions, getting in the process, showing up, because this is an incremental fight and we have to fight it at all times on as many fronts as we can. And, that's why we need members.
Excellent. Okay, so in 2015, you were appointed to the International Advisory Board for Terrestrial Energy. Tell us about this role.
I was really flattered when that happened. I think in truth, they just couldn't get Barry Brook. I think I was the ring-in substitute.
Oh, what did I say? 90% of success is just showing up.
Yeah, it's just showing up. Well, I was available. No, look, that I think there's a grain of truth in that. But yeah, in about 2015, I was approached by Terrestrial Energy, and I think I was doing some work interstate. I think I was in Melbourne at the time when I had my first conversation with these people. And it was very interesting because until then, I had probably built more of a reputation around solid fuel fast reactors like the Prism reactor, which is the commercial iteration of the integral fast reactor. So, solid metal fuel fast reactor paired with pyroprocessing for this sort of used nuclear fuel recycling program. And so, as far as advanced reactor technologies goes, that was mostly what I talked about. And so I was a bit skeptical, frankly, about what this company from Canada had to offer that General Electric's Prism reactor, what didn't have to offer, why it wasn't better. And so interestingly, they took it upon themselves. They sort of realised they kind of had to sell me on why they were a company worth being involved with, and they really did. The things I remember about that first conversation with Canon Brian, I think, was on the line. I think Simon Irish and David LeBlanc. One of the first things that they impressed upon me is that they weren't trying to build the perfect reactor. They were trying to build the commercial reactor. There was a certain element of their capitalism, frankly, that appealed to me. Because frankly, I think we needed that. I think we needed people who believed in what they were doing for the right reasons, but also understood that unless they sold thousands of these things, it wasn't going to be a commercial success. So they realized that they sort of seemed to know when to stop innovating and when to start commercializing. And I was really impressed with the structured way in which they thought that through. I didn't know very much about liquid fuel reactors at the time whatsoever, so I had to go away and do a little bit of learning, and I found a lot to like. And that was part of the process of me understanding that most of these advanced reactor technologies actually have an awful lot of synergy. They're not really competitors in a sense. There's a job for all of these different designs with their respective advantages and disadvantages. And then finally, they were just really good people with really good ethics. They had put the right people in the right jobs. They didn't have the engineer trying to be the CFO. They got a CFO. They didn't have the engineer trying to be a lawyer. They got a lawyer. And the lawyer, wrote a thesis on tiger conservation. I liked these people. And so I ended up deciding I was actually really delighted to be a part of that and to lend, what credibility and standing I had at the time toward their effort. And that's been a good relationship. I've brought advice to Terrestrial Energy from time to time in some of their environmental and sustainability positioning. I'm very proud with the leadership that Terrestrial Energy has showed in the industry in terms of building a message about coalition, in terms of building a message about all clean energy technologies working together, and in terms of showing up. Again, it's a theme I'm harping on today, but Terrestrial Energy shows up. They show up at environmental conversations. They show up at green energy conversations where nuclear typically sort of had come to the conclusion that they weren't invited. And these guys kind of said, no, I think we are invited actually, and I think we might invite ourselves. And I really, really like that. So it's been it's a non-executive position. I don't have any executive authority. It's an unpaid position, and I'm very, I'm proud of that. But it's been an excellent opportunity for me to, I guess, offer that extra level of support to at least one organisation that's actually doing the thing I'm not doing. You know, me and Bright New World are not bringing product to market. That's not our job, and we can't do that. We're never going to do that. But we want, I want everyone in the space to succeed, and this was an opportunity for me to say, well, these people have shown the faith in me as someone that they see value in as part of what they're trying to create. And that's been it's been a terrifically positive experience. I'm certainly, very confident that they're going to succeed. Um, they seem to know how to execute a business plan in a very measured and determined fashion. They don't. They're not trying to sell the world on what they're going to have done in 5 years. They're quite consistent on saying this is what we have done in these 12 months, and this is what we're doing in the next 6 to get to where we're going. I think that's very impressive. So yeah, it's been a really positive professional experience for me.
I went along to the Nuclear Innovation Boot Camp in University of Berkeley, California in 2017. It was really interesting, and they were there. I met
Oh,
a couple of these
fantastic.
people that you spoke to, but yeah, it's a really impressive sort of bit of kit that they're putting together and kicking goals. Like, I mean, yes, obviously they're building it in Canada, but they're in constant sort of chats with the NRC in America. It says, okay, what can we do to get the regulatory framework change such that you now know how to regulate an exotic design such as a molten salt reactor.
Yeah, that's right, and that's it's just such another great example of where we, people will call me a leader, but the fact is, so many of us need to lead in our particular places and in our particular jobs, and they do that really well. They've demonstrated the way an effective business needs to run in this nuclear space. And I think they're demonstrating that really, really well. I don't think there's a shortage of great nuclear designs out there. I think where we might have been a little short was on really strong businesses. And I'm glad to see that that is changing, as I see several of the companies that I've flagged already in this podcast, really walking the walk. And that's brilliant. And yeah, I mean, we do need, regulation that is reflective of the technological realities. Otherwise, we have a situation where you go to register your electric car, and they ask you how many cylinders it has. Um,
Exactly.
right?
So
And
that's
you
a
go,
great
well,
that's a great way to it's a great metaphor.
yeah. And you're saying, it doesn't have any because it's an electric car. And they say, well, I'm sorry, unless you can check that box, I can't register your car. It's an absurd situation, but it's actually closer to the truth
Yeah.
than we would like. And I'm really excited to see some of that changing. I'm not sure if you've seen this week, Logan, or might have been last week, but some of the emergency planning zone provisions have been changed for these advanced reactors because the NRC is seeing that it just doesn't work the way reactors worked in the past. Their control room decisions, but saying yes, a single control room will be appropriate for these multi-unit small modular reactor plants. They're such boring things. They're not things that the person in the street's going to get excited to hear, but they're so materially important in making these propositions commercial. And it's pretty super exciting to see that going on.
Absolutely. Okay, so unsurprisingly, you were a supporting voice during the South Australian Royal Commission into the nuclear fuel cycle. Now, ultimately, the Commission found that there's not an economic case with the exception of a spent fuel repository, which at this point is not being pursued. What did Australia gain from this Royal Commission? What do you...
We gained a lot. And one thing we gained that the Nuclear Commission did extremely well is a very good chain of evidence about that conversation. The documentation of what happened, who came, who spoke, what the submissions were, what the arguments were, and how they came to their conclusions is really, really good. And that body of knowledge and information remains there. So we had a very important conversation in Australia that was documented really, really nicely. Some of the challenges include that the finding about nuclear power was influenced by the fact that the boundary of that investigation was South Australia, was my state, which is a small state. You know, we're 1.6 million people. And so in the context of South Australia alone, they didn't find a strong case for the use of nuclear power generation. But they weren't asked about the entire national electricity market, which is the system we're a part of, which links Queensland, South Australia, New South Wales, Tasmania, and Victoria all together in one grid. That's a different question that could give a very different answer. And again, that gets spun. You know, that gets spun by opponents to say that the Royal Commission found nuclear power is no good for Australia. No, they didn't. They made a finding about South Australia, and they made a pretty clear statement that we need good, proper investigations of all technologies Australia-wide if we're going to be interested in that. But they rightly parked it because that wasn't really the question that they were being asked to answer. As far as the used nuclear fuel issue goes, I'm very sad. I'm just genuinely very sad that stopped in the way that it stopped. I have the privilege of going around the world quite a bit for the things that I'm now being asked to do, and without fail, in jurisdiction after jurisdiction, expert after expert asks me about that proposal and how it went on. Or if they don't know about it, we'll have a conversation about it, and inevitably the feedback comes back of that was a really good idea. You know, it's a really, really good idea. And I was with Ed Key when I was last in Fukushima, and we went to the reactor together. He runs the nuclear fuel cycle economics, the nuclear economics consulting group in the United States. He's an absolute gun of knowledge for nuclear fuel cycle economics. Yeah, and his organization produced a report which was leveraged to help end South Australia considering this idea. Well, if you read that report, that's not really what they were saying. They were saying you'd need to manage the risk of it carefully. You'd need to go through, construct a gated process where you invest slowly, a little at a time, to get the answers you need to proceed to the next stage. They identified some assumptions that they didn't think were appropriate from the work that had been done. Now that's contested by the consultants that worked in the Royal Commission, who thought they were being very conservative. But be that as it may, that's part of a robust economic discussion that you can have to move forward in a responsible way. And Ed was frank with me again when we were in Japan, going, look, that was a really interesting idea. I'm glad the idea has been out there, it has been had, and we have that evidence because it can be used again. But I would like us to frame it differently. I didn't like the very one-way pathway that was proposed, which was basically accept material and bury it. Now, right from the start, myself, along with Senator Sean Edwards and others, were trying to say, no, let's accept material. Sometime in future, there will need to be disposal of waste. In between those two places, there's a hell of a lot of exciting things that we can do with technology. And we can use that revenue to help a commercialization process for lots of different technologies, like pyroprocessing, recycling of used nuclear fuel, like commercialization of a solid fuel fast reactor to pair with that, like a hub for commercialization for molten salt reactors of various types that can also use the pyroprocessing facility. And I tried to put it to the Economics Committee, and I think the term I used was that we need to be, what we could be is a full service provider at that end of the fuel cycle that delivers so much more value than just putting stuff a very, very long way underground. And, you know, it was a point of disagreement that I had with the people that were operating the Royal Commission, and at least we could have the frank discussion where they said, look, we feel like we need to remain within this pretty tight boundary of what's already established in the nuclear industry, which is that ultimately you do deep geologic disposal. And I was trying to push back against that and saying, I just don't think that's an exciting enough vision to get this over the line. I think what we actually need to do is express to people that this is an incredibly good thing we're doing. Otherwise, I felt like a bit of a punitive model, really. A bit like we're being bribed with an absolute ton of cash to take stuff and stick it under the ground. Now, people
it's a
like
hard
money.
sell to make.
Well, you know,
when
it
you
is.
frame it like that.
Well, that's the thing. I think that people misunderstand the framing. Everyone likes money, right? Like, no joke. We all like money. We would all love to be living in a rich society and doing whatever we can do with that money. But think about it like this. Say you and me are sitting down for a coffee. I say, Logan, look down at your feet and you see a suitcase at your feet. I say, Logan, in the suitcase, there's $1 million. I'm going to stand up and leave, and it's yours. Now, what are you going to do with it, mate? Are you going to take it or not take it? One of the questions you're going to have going in your head is, why are you giving me that? And you are going to want me to give you a good reason, right? You're going to want a reason to feel good about. We weren't giving South Australians a reason to feel good about. We were giving them a result, an outcome, a huge amount of money, and expecting that was going to get people over the line. We were missing the human motivation point. We were missing the sell to Australians to say we could be of enormous service to the world, do an enormous amount of good, create new technologies, modernize, help other nations with serious problems, help the world bring down greenhouse gas emissions. That's why we're doing this. We forgot to explain why. We just told South Australians, here's the economic modelling to show what we think you can get. It was an over appeal to greed. Missing.
And people are mistrustful of such a message.
Deservedly so. Deservedly so.
I think it's just before we sort of go on, do you want to just sort of give a bit of a description of what nuclear waste actually is? Because when we say nuclear waste, what is that? You know, that's things, oh, horrible, nasty, radioactive stuff. But it's actually a bit more involved as to what's actually in it and the business case of what can possibly be done with spent fuel / nuclear waste. There's a lot of options there.
There's a heap of options. Nuclear waste is an umbrella term. It can be a huge amount of things. Do we mean waste from defense programs from the United States and Britain? Do we mean waste from research programs all over the world? Or do we mean used nuclear fuel? They are all incredibly distinct. And even within those areas, it's distinct. And this, again, was part of the challenge where I feel like this wasn't expressed well enough. We were speaking only about used nuclear fuel. Used nuclear fuel, which I'm determined not to call it nuclear waste, it isn't waste. Used nuclear fuel is a solid ceramic. They're pellets of fuel that were loaded into rods, that were loaded into assemblies, where an enormous amount of power with no greenhouse gas emissions was extracted. It comes out looking almost exactly like it went in. Its composition is slightly different because of the fission process that it has been through, and there's been some transmutation and the creation of some new elements in that used nuclear fuel. But most of it is actually still uranium, natural uranium that comes out of the ground, uranium-238. It's still a solid. It's very, very highly radioactive when it comes out. After a few years, it's substantially less radioactive. But it's not gaseous, it's not liquid, it's not sloshing around, it's not threatening to escape and run riot in the environment. After sort of 5 years of cooling, it can be put into a dry cask, and where it sits on a concrete pad, an incredibly undemanding long-term solution that's good for 100 years. Now, because most of what's in there is still natural uranium, and some of the rest of it is plutonium and other heavy actinides, there's plenty of good fuel still in there. And the step we need to take next is the cleaning step. So with that fuel, you can clean it up, you can remove the fission products from that fuel, you can get the plutonium and heavy actinides, that's good for fuel right away, and you can use that again. But if you use a fast reactor, you can use all of that uranium-238 to make new fuel again.
And this is important because when we talk about enriched fuel, we say something like, this fuel is 3% enriched. What that means is that's 3% uranium-235. That's the fuel source used in conventional technology today.
Exactly.
The other 97%, that's the 238. And that's what these fast reactors are looking at utilizing. And when you compare those two values together, you think, oh my God, that's what most of this stuff is?
That's right. It's a staggering volume of potential energy. It's more accurately thought of as a type of ore body that needs some processing and some cleaning to extract the value. And where this all ends is that we've only used about 1/20th of the energy value in that fuel. There's another 19 times, or thereabouts, the energy in that fuel available. It's a staggering quantity of potential energy. There's so much energy in used nuclear fuel that we could run the whole world for about 1,000 years on the uranium we have already mined. without mining any more uranium, any more coal, any more gas, simply by applying technology to get at the rest of this energy. And the kicker that really gets people over the line and excited here is that when we go about it in that way, the genuine waste that we're left with, the fission products, they only have a half-life of 30 years. So this whole idea of science fiction time frame disposal, which is understandably intimidating, and in my opinion, highly questionable strategy, goes away. We would only ever be seeking to dispose of something with a half-life of 30 years, such that in 10 half-lives, 300 years, it's fundamentally back to the levels that are found in nature. And the sorts of volumes that we're talking about are tiny. So it's like taking an unopened tube of toothpaste with a little bit of foil on the end of it, and instead of ripping off the whole lid or cutting the scissors off and squeezing it all out and throwing it away, it's more like just putting a pinprick in the end of it and squeezing out a little bit at a time. It's just tiny quantities of much more easily managed waste over time, and each time you're getting some more of that waste, you're getting another massive quantity of energy out of it. And so we've got the framing of used nuclear fuel all wrong. The nuclear industry has a lot to answer for in that. You know, that is where the nuclear industry needs to take so much more institutional responsibility for mis-selling what they are. And again, it comes back to human psychology. Don't tell me it's not dangerous when you're proposing to bury it 300 meters underground, encased in copper, steel, and concrete, backfilled with bentonite, with a sign on the door to supposedly tell aliens, 100,000 years from now, don't come in. And then you have the gall to come and tell me, no, used nuclear fuel is not that dangerous. It's idiotic. It's idiotic human psychology. We actually have to have the behaviors that are believable. If you tell people one thing and behave another way, they're going to believe your behavior. If they say, don't worry, everything's fine, as they're running in the other direction, what do you believe, right? And that's what the nuclear industry doesn't do well. It thinks that by demonstrating this extraordinary level of precautionary behavior in dealing with used nuclear fuel, that we are reassuring people. We're actually not. What reassures people are the sorts of videos that James Conker made recently, where he's there standing next to dry nuclear fuel casks and explaining to people what they are and explaining why this is okay. That's what helps people understand that there's more going on here than they've thought before. And that's one where I have to say, the thing about activism is that it doesn't create problems. It inflates problems. Okay, activists can rarely pull actual rabbits out of hats, but what they're really good at doing is taking a truth and turning it into something monumental. So anti-nuclear activism takes the truth of the way the nuclear industry missells the used nuclear fuel story and inflates it into an absolute monster. And that's them doing their job. Don't expect them to behave any differently. That is what they are going to do. The industry's responsibility over here is to actually take it upon themselves to change that framing. And until they do that, we're just giving anti-nuclear activism a leg up. And I just think we should stop. And that's what myself and Senator Edwards and others were trying to do with our proposal, which is to say, no, this isn't a disposal program. This is a resource. We are going to invest in exploiting this resource and delivering an enormous amount of social good. And when people understood our proposal, they loved it. And I can tell you that people are still reading that proposal. People in politics today are still reading that proposal and still loving it. There's definitely something there, but nuclear is going to need to break out of its conservatism in the way it sells the used nuclear fuel story.
It sort of comes back to what you were saying about the Royal Commission only looked at what can South Australia do. I think what your proposal and Senator Sean Edwards' proposal is that PRISM reactor, once it's commercialised, it's not there yet, but that is a system for the NEM. It is not just for South Australia.
That's right. We had to sell this as making ourselves integrated into a greater national and international good, and we didn't do that. The Royal Commission put forward fundamentally a pretty parochial proposal. Here's what South Australia will do for South Australia, and we'll make a lot of cash. It it didn't express how this is going to benefit the rest of the nation, everyone else in Australia. Didn't even really make the sell for how this is going to benefit our neighbours. Now, if you take a neighbour like Indonesia or Malaysia, these are very, very big countries. Indonesia is going to have as many people as the United States. They're going to be like a 300 million person country, and they are coal fired. They are really coal fired. And if you take an Indonesia, and they're volcanic and they're all the rest, right? And they have to decide, where are we going to get our energy from, coal or nuclear fission? Well, the fact is we've made coal easier because polluting with coal is free, right? There is no waste management program for your coal-fired power generation. If Australia was running that multinational fuel service, we change the arithmetic of those decisions for countries like Indonesia, where they go, we now feel the confidence to invest in a nuclear power program because a trusted neighbour under an international program is running a multinational used fuel repository. So we didn't even sell the fact that running that multinational used fuel repository would help other nations bring down their greenhouse gas emissions by choosing nuclear. Or possibly the reason they didn't sell that is because they were so afraid of the activists who were saying, this program will help grow nuclear power worldwide. And they weren't even prepared to embrace that and say, you're goddamn right it will. And that's the point, because nuclear power is good, not bad. We need so much more courage in that. And that's exactly what Mark Parnell and the Greens here in South Australia were transparently saying. They'll say, look, yes, we acknowledge there's a problem with used nuclear fuel because PS, we've been saying that for decades, right? That's their main talking point. The nuclear waste is a problem. But they're saying, yes, but if you solve that in this way, that will only allow us to build more nuclear power plants. So we have to develop the institutional courage to say, you're goddamn right it will. Tell me why that's a bad thing. And we didn't do that. So we've got to, in Australia, we've got to break out of being so goddamn Australian. I mean, I love being Australian, right?
We need to get out of our own way.
We do. And we need to understand we're part of a bigger world. We've got a role to play. What is that role? And understand that's part of building the case. We can do it, but we've got a long way to go.
Absolutely. All right, bit of a long-winded one, and actually, when I wrote this question a few weeks ago, things have moved on a bit, so we'll see how we go. Despite massive investment in renewables over the last decade, they have minimal contribution to the electricity generation compared to our coal and our gas, and according to the 2017 Energy Update report. Our fleet of coal-fired power stations are in the back half of their lives. Many will close over the next decade, and we're not currently building any replacements, nor planning any. We're favouring gas, which is simply another fossil fuel, cheap capital setup but expensive fuel costs, and typically used for peak loads. The cost of electricity is continually rising, and government action appears lacking. Are we heading for a national energy crisis?
Yeah, yes. We're actually already in it, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. It's so bad, and it's worse than people realize. The fact is that we've had an absence of policy. We've had an absence of energy investment policy other than the renewable energy target now for over a decade. The absence of policy hasn't halted Australia from beginning to embark on what's called an energy transition. So where we're investing in a lot of wind and solar, which is happening a lot all over the world. It doesn't stop that from happening. It just means it's happening badly. It's happening in an unstructured way. It's happening in a way where the regulations in the market aren't keeping pace. It's happening in a way where the regulations in the market aren't getting to feed back to that project development and say, we're not unsupportive of this happening, but we would like to see it happen in this approximate time frame, in this approximate structure. And it's leading to the most enormous structural and technical problems in Australia's power sector. And every time this transition grows in this unstructured way, we're locking in more and more problems that are going to need to be ironed out as they start to flow through the power sector here. And all of that has a terrible impact for consumers. have this situation where people are talking about it. I've said we're talking about, cheap wind, right? Wind is cheap. Wind is now cheaper than coal. Okay, now that's actually true. If you're trying to build 2 new plants, the levelized cost of electricity out of the new plants, a modern, appropriately built coal-fired power station is price X. The wind is price Y, and price Y is lower than price X. Fine. But here's the other thing. It gets to a point where if you are building new wind, say in South Australia, it might be low cost, but it's zero value. There's so much wind already in South Australia that if you build another wind farm here, unless things change, i.e. a lot more storage or a lot more interconnection, when the wind blows, the price goes negative. And so your new wind farm, the power that it has added has no value. So it's one thing to say, look, it's only a levelized cost of electricity of $75 a megawatt hour. That's well and good. But the thing is, for so many more times now, when your wind turbines are spinning, the price is zero or negative. So we're building cheap power, but power with very little value in the market. And that's where we're getting it wrong.
So what does it actually mean when you say it's price negative? Does that mean it's got nowhere to go? No one wants to use it. No one needs it. What's it actually mean?
That's right. It means we're dramatically oversupplied. And so, the way the national electricity market works is it's a bidding system. You have a market interval. There's a certain amount of demand. Let's call it 100 units, whatever it's going to be at the given time. And suppliers bid in, and the last supplier to bid in sets the price, and everyone gets paid that price for that market increment. Okay? Great. If you build so much wind in South Australia and the wind is blowing, all of those wind farms, first of all, they're receiving a renewable energy certificate. So part of their operating revenue is already paid for. They've got that certificate no matter what the price is. So they're getting some money. So they all bid in at close to zero. Now, when you first started building wind in South Australia, you could bid in at close to zero and be sure that the rest of that increment in the market would be filled by other bidders, and you would end up being paid that final bid price, whatever that might be. But now those increments are being filled by all wind, fundamentally bidding in at zero. So the market is supplied, it's met, and they all get paid zero. So when these power sources are so strongly correlated with each other, what they effectively do is cannibalize their own market. And now we're beginning to see that in rooftop solar PV in South Australia as well, where in midday there's just so much power coming on that if you're trying to sell solar at that time, your prices are terrible because there's just too much of it at the time, and prices are really low. So you've either got to find more customers elsewhere in the grid, which means you've got to build more interconnection so you can sell into more locations, right? Which adds cost, can be net beneficial. So I'm not saying don't necessarily do it, but that's some of the cost that isn't represented in the raw cost of the wind and the solar. Or you need to build storage infrastructure to pull some of that extra power off and sell it later. That's more cost. And that storage infrastructure, the power coming out of that storage is going to be a lot more expensive. So we're having this incredibly unstructured situation where everyone's chasing this same ideal, but the market is changing all around them. Now, if you went and built wind, say in Queensland, where they have very little wind power, you're not going to get that same phenomenon. And that's what I mean about structuring this and saying, maybe in this section of the market, we're kind of full when it comes to wind. If you want to invest in wind, please come over here and do it here. Or maybe, you have to start saying to householders, or you have to start incentivizing them, build your solar panels facing west, please. So, this whole history of solar in Australia has been about creating volume supply. Let's get as much electricity from solar as we can, which means you face them north. So you get the maximum amount of sun during the day. But it also means you get your peak output in the middle of the day. I think that's a mistake. We shouldn't be going for high volume output from solar PV. We should be going for high value output from solar PV. Now, in somewhere like Adelaide, we get in really difficult times on hot days between about 4 and 7 p.m. in summer when it's stinking hot, the sun's still up, everyone's running their electricity. And if your solar system is north facing, its production is going down at that time. At the same time as prices are going up and up and up, your output's going down and down and down. A west-facing solar PV system is supplying the market when it needs the supply. And that's where renewable technologies can be excellent. You've got supply that's close to load. It's supplying at the time when the market approximately needs it. It lowers stress on the network and the systems. So that's where we have this unstructured approach, where not enough engineers have been in the room, not enough regulators have been listened to, and we've just got high volume, low value supply being built in Australia. We're going to need to redress that balance because all of that high volume, low value supply is creating problems. It also creates problems because it doesn't provide the ancillary services that the market requires. It doesn't provide the frequency control that stabilizes our grid. It does eat the market for the other providers that do, though. So eventually, some of those providers leave the market. And that's what we've seen in South Australia with our coal-fired generation. We're going to see it with other coal-fired assets. And what we're discovering now, it shouldn't be a surprise, but it is, those assets weren't just making electricity, they were making stability. The new assets make electricity, but they don't make stability. So we're losing two things when we thought we were only losing one. And again, that's when the cost comes back in, where you have people like other players who are responsible for that saying, okay, well, we now need to go and build some synchronous condensers over here to help stabilize the grid. And you go, who pays for that? Well, the taxpayer pays for that, not the renewable energy developers, right? They're not internalizing those costs in their development. So this so-called cheap wind and solar is such a partial truth. There's so much more to it than that to create an effective system. And the concerning thing is that we're only getting started. There's still a flood of investment in Australia coming in wind and solar, and little to no redress of these problems in a structured way. And the problems that we've seen in Canberra this week just make that worse again. You know, I flatter myself, I flatter my own philosophy that I would hope that maybe nuclear technology is some sort of a circuit breaker there, where you could argue and say, look, we're not arguing against the need to lower greenhouse gas emissions. This is a clean energy technology, but it also brings stability. It also brings high capacity credit, so that if you're having one of those days in Adelaide that is stinking hot, but it also happens to be cloudy, which does happen, you know, the nuclear will be there if the solar isn't performing at its best that day. We've got to think in terms of how do we address all of these problems, or this crisis that you've talked about. It's still coming. It's starting, but it's still coming. And yeah, hold on, basically.
It kind of astounds me because I remember when I was reading the 2006 Swakowski report, sort of one of the when they looked into sort of nuclear power for Australia, 10 years ago. The finding essentially from that was because we have so much coal and fossil fuels that it's just no economic case to do nuclear. And I think, well, how is it now? If wind is so cheap, how have we got the highest electricity prices? Pretty much in the Western world, or some of the highest in the Western world. It's something's gone wrong.
Yes, something has gone wrong, because the price that you're paying is the price of the system. It isn't the price of the wind or the solar. That's entirely isolated. You know, you can put up a project proposal and say our power from this solar farm is only going to cost this. Well, I'm sorry, but by the time I've switched on my appliance to actually consume power, I've had to pay for everything it takes to make that service available to me. You know, electricity is a commodity, but a functional grid is a service, and that's been dramatically misunderstood. You know, the trick is to provide a service for a country. Can I have reliable power anytime at an affordable price? That's the challenge. It's not, it's not like, it's not like buying, something discounted at Aldi and you can buy a whole lot of it and just use it when you need it. Electricity doesn't store cheaply and easily. The storing electricity is really bloody hard. I mean, in fact, storing electricity is almost impossible. We have various ways of storing energy and reconverting it to electricity, but it's really costly. And so those relationships are just completely misunderstood. So we need a lot more courage from government. We also need, I think, more forthright participation of some of the key organisations in Australia who are in charge of this, to give us more forthright advice and findings about how challenging this is going to become. I'd like to see more breadth in Australia's academic sector. where we're not having such an ideological battle in energy literature about the generating technologies, and we're having a more informed conversation about the creation of the system. And I still don't think that's happening. I mean, when myself and my co-authors published a paper called Burden of Proof a few years ago, reviewing 100% renewable electricity systems, I think that was one of the first, big flares that we were able to shoot in the air and say, hey, look over here, there's stuff people haven't thought about yet. And I'm glad that paper was such a success, and I know it has shaped the conversation and it's brought some more of these issues to light, but we still got a long way to go. The idea of, Australia has so much coal. So even if you were to say think what you like or say what you like about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions in our globalised economy and with the corporate boards in Australia, it might just be that financing new Australian coal in future just isn't a proposition that private organisations can absorb anymore. We might need to face up to that. And some of those coal supporters in Canberra are suggesting, well, then that's why government will need to step in to make sure we can build new coal. And that's when I sort of step out and go, if we're prepared to have any degree of government intervention here to create the type of system we need, I think the right technology to put that behind is nuclear fission, along with these renewable energy technologies, and be pragmatic in that sense. And just try to take some of the heat out of the conversation and say this is about outcomes. It's not about technology favoritism. We've got, I can't express enough how big the challenges are for Australia's power sector at the moment.
It is the challenge humanity is facing. I think it's actually got to the point where people are saying, yes, climate change is a problem. We really can't sweep this under the rug anymore.
Right.
And that actually sort of feeds nicely into sort of my next question. So energy decarbonisation is necessary for our planet's future. What would you say sort of specifically to younger listeners that might be tuned into this?
Oh, gee. Sorry? Well, what would I say?
What would you encourage them to do? Maybe they're students, they're wondering what path to take.
Listen, the thing I'd encourage them to first of all think is that there is nothing about dealing with climate change that means our future needs to be anything other than brilliant and better than the past. We have the tools and we have the technology. Do not be afraid. This is something incredibly exciting if we get behind the right approaches. That's just going to make the world better. I guess I would encourage all of those people to be constantly doing the check on, am I becoming ideological? Am I becoming overly persuaded in one area? Am I spending enough time stepping back? Am I being impartial enough about what's in front of me? If this is an area of interest, because we need more and more of us to be prepared to do that, where we can have conversations where our position, I guess you could describe it, might be strongly defended but only loosely held. So if you get new information that needs you to evolve your thinking, you do. And this is happening for me all the time. I mean, I'm continually exposed to the energy transition and what's coming down the line, and I'm reading the reports from our market operator and our energy regulator, and there is more potential in some of these technologies than I would have thought 5 years ago. I have to be continuing to evolve those processes. And so I think I would be encouraging young people, if they were trying to speak up and out, to say, we have total confidence that we can deal with this challenge, and now we expect you to be getting on with it. And this is the sort of way we want you to have that conversation. And look, and again, the obvious plug that I would make is, if this sounds interesting, please come and join Bright New World. I mean, please jump on our Facebook page. Please have these conversations. Please, there are some terrific students at Uni in New South Wales that are wanting to start a students' association to talk about nuclear power. And again, it's a bit like terrestrial energy, showing up where they're supposedly not invited, but saying, no, we should be having this conversation too. Be active. There's no end of change you can create if you want to get interested and involved in this. No end at all. We have the tools and we have the knowledge. I think the trick now is to build the networks and start ourselves marching in the same general direction. If we can do that, we can actually get the change that we need.
Well, okay. Bright New World is obviously obviously what you're working on at the moment. Where can they find that? Do you want to just give us the web
Yeah,
address or?
absolutely. Look, brightnewworld.org, so www.brightnewworld.org is our website. Love it if people would go and visit and have a read. You know, if you read the front page of the website, you'll kind of get a version of our manifesto, you know, what our vision for the world is. And if you go and have a look at our about page, you'll get our constitution, where you'll get our constitutionally stated values, you know, where you'll really see that nuclear technology is a means to an end. You know, we're about the world we're trying to create. We have a blog there, the Bright New blog, where there's writing, particularly from me, and in future there's going to be more, where you can see what it is we're trying to argue and the sort of world we're trying to create there. And we have a Facebook page, which is an active community. I'm going to make a really blatant pitch here. I'd love to see more women joining the page and joining the organisation. This is such a gendered issue globally. It's massively gendered. When you look at who is, broadly speaking, comfortable with nuclear power technology and who isn't, you get one thing. When you split it up by gender, it's a wow thing. It can be sort of a 20 percentage point difference between how men feel about this and how women feel about this. So we really have to try to engage really, really hard with women in Australia and around the world. And a big part of that is, if you are a woman that thinks this is something worth doing, please come and join. Please, because you make it easier for other women to participate as well. I mean, I'm a man, can't help that. That's not going to change. Got nothing, got nothing against myself and other men. We're grouse, but it's not, you know, we can't do it alone. So we've tried with Bright New World to create a very friendly social media space. You know, we moderate in a way that means it is about discussion. You know, we don't tolerate bullying. We don't tolerate people being overly opinionated, even if we know it's coming from the right place. You know, we keep that place safe for people to have conversations. And I'd really, really welcome the participation of more women. That would be, it's actually almost, I'd say this to almost to anyone who's wanting to work in the space in Australia or worldwide. I'd say one of the first questions you need to ask is, what's our strategy to ensure that women are a part of this conversation? Like that demographic difference that's shown in survey after survey all around the world means if you're not asking that question, you're not looking at the data and the evidence. And that's supposed to be what we're all about, right? Well, the data and the evidence here is that we've got a huge job to do in reaching out to women. And if you are a woman, you can be a huge part of that by reaching back out to us.
Just to sort of dovetail into that, there's two organisations that are probably worth mentioning in this regard, and one of them is Women in Nuclear, which actually has an Australian chapter.
Yep.
I remember actually part of that innovation boot camp. I actually went to a Women in Nuclear conference that was running at the same time, and they had like a meet and greet at the end of it that all the students all went along to that, and that was really big.
Yep.
I don't think the Australian chapter is as large. I think that's to be understood, but it does exist.
It certainly does.
There is also another thing that's right.
Mothers for Nuclear.
That's the one in the United States, which is actually just, I think, an advocacy body just started by two mothers. They said, oh my God, here's nuclear. Yeah. We want this for our future generation.
Absolutely. Kristen and Heather, two really great friends of mine. They are wonderful, wonderful women. Ida from Finland is another active mother for nuclear. Those two organisations are absolutely tremendous. The Australian chapter of Women in Nuclear is really active. I mean, I had the privilege of speaking for them once in Sydney a couple of years ago. I'd also point out that Australia won the International Youth Nuclear Congress for, I think, 2020. So the ANSTO. Yeah, the ANSTO team was successful. They had stiff competition. Like I think it was Dubai, Tokyo. Can't remember who the other competitor was. It might have even been Beijing. It was tough competition, and you know, reliving the Sydney Olympics, the winner is Sydney, right? So, this is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for us all to come together and really talk about Australia's place in this whole question. And yeah, I mean, Women in Nuclear and Mothers for Nuclear organisations, I just can't recommend highly enough. They do brilliant work, and I consider both organisations Bright New World's allies. I hope they consider us the same way.
Very good. All right. The Friends of the Earth website has a special page dedicated just for you.
Oh,
Have you
come
ever
on.
read it?
Yes.
I went through it myself and I thought, wow, there's so much. This is incredible. It's like, you're the devil, basically. It's glorious.
Yes.
Oh, I was like, yeah, conspiracy theorists. It was, yeah. I just reading it. I thought, oh, this is not the person I know.
Yes, it's quite a thing. I'm not sure what to say. I'm not quite sure what to say about that, except that I have to presume that means we're doing something effective. You don't pull that sort of character assassination against someone unless you're really determined to persuade other people not to hear what they have to say. So I guess I take it as a form of endorsement. Um, it doesn't make for a very pleasant read.
No.
I don't like being branded as racist. I don't like having other people tell me what my politics are. I don't like having people infer that I'm corrupt. I don't like having people fundamentally blame me for things like armed conflict in other parts of the world, or infer that I somehow have a level of responsibility for atrocities in parts of the world because of some extremely long bow that's being drawn between work I might have done and a bomb someone dropped somewhere. It isn't very nice, but I take it as a sort of a badge of honor. It seems to be the only way to deal with that. I'm sort of stuck with it. I'm not sure it works that well for them because, generally speaking, a thing happens where I'll be invited to come and do something. Inevitably, it will be publicized. Inevitably, the author of that page, who is Jim Green, will contact the organization who's invited me to tell them that I'm a racist, extremist bully who isn't going to tell the truth about nuclear. And then I show up and I'm remarkably moderate. And I'm quite openly critical about aspects of the nuclear industry. And I'm incredibly evidence-based in terms of the cost and in terms of the data that I draw from. So painting me as such a monster, only for people to find that I actually approach these things in a fairly diligent way, I don't think it works for them. And it's just something I have to live with. I mean, I don't know, Logan, did you have a favorite bit? Is there something that
one of the things I
jumped
thought
out?
was interesting is there was an area where they said you were paid a certain amount of money for your capabilities in energy analyzing, and ultimately, it, it said something like you weren't able to produce a good design for a nuclear reactor or something like that. And I thought, really? Like, this guy developed some skills and got educated and built a company, and therefore he shouldn't be allowed to utilize those skills to make some money.
Look, it's hard to know sort of where those arguments begin and end. I think they begin wherever it suits them. I think there's something specific going on there because when I was operating Think Climate Consulting, the state government of South Australia wanted a preliminary investigation into whether there were opportunities in the nuclear fuel cycle that South Australia might consider, because we were on the road to economic ruin here in South Australia. Now, I bid for that work and won it. There's a fairly good reason why I would be selected to do that work. I have a really good background knowledge in exactly the areas they were wanting to explore. I provided them a report. They paid for it because it is public sector work. The amount that Think Climate Consulting was paid, which was something in the order of $50,000 by the time we were all done, is public record, right? So you can go and get a Freedom of Information request to find out what that amount of money was, and make it sound like Ben Hurd creamed the South Australian taxpayer for $50,000 to produce a shoddy report. Well, the way these things actually work is, first of all, the report, nearly every chapter of it went on to be pretty solidly reproduced by the Nuclear Fuel Cycle Royal Commission. So we pretty much said the same thing, that the uranium mining industry in South Australia has space to grow, but wouldn't be economically transformative if it did. We said that enrichment is probably not a strong opportunity for South Australia, nor conversion, nor fabrication, because they're really already overserviced in the world, so not a strong opportunity there. We pointed out that power production would be challenging in South Australia for various reasons, and we pointed out that there's probably a really large opportunity in receiving used nuclear fuel. Now, we also went on to point out the potential of fast reactors and fuel recycling. No, those are the parts that the Nuclear Fuel Cycle Royal Commission did not endorse. But the balance of the report, the findings were really largely reproduced. Now, the Royal Commission cost something like $8 million, and Think Climate Consulting produced this report for $50,000, right, and came up with similar findings. And it was done over a period of 6 or 7 months with subcontractors, and I pay tax. So, what you have here is exactly what you've described. It's someone who's adequately qualified and experienced, who has started a business, who bids for work, wins it, and delivers it. What you have from Friends of the Earth's point of view is someone that they don't like, that they want to tear down. Good luck to them, but it doesn't really seem to pan out that way. Please go on.
I think people are wising up, and it's not just the nuclear industry. It's strategies like that get used in all sorts of areas, in just everywhere. And I think now that the internet exists and people can actually look stuff up and think, I'm just going to have a look for this myself. I think the internet is, okay, it's a tool where a lot of misinformation can be spread, but it's also a very good tool for very accurate information. I think people that want to know about stuff will look into things, and I think it's a strategy that's only going to get less effective, not more effective.
Yeah, and you can do yourself favors or no favors in that space as well. I mean, maximizing your own transparency from the start makes it very, very difficult to have that sort of strategy be effective. I mean, every time that Bright New World produces a newsletter, if I have been out working or doing things in the world, there are disclosures at the bottom of that newsletter to say, where was I? What was I doing? How did I get there? Who paid for the travel? Did we accept a fee or not? It's there in the newsletter. Right. And it's there in the newsletter as disclosures because we're not ashamed, because it's perfectly legitimate activity to be undertaking. And, I had this on Facebook this week. Someone sort of saying, why don't you confess to who you are, and quoting a few lines about, are you or are you not this? And I'm like, yeah, I think that sounds like what you read from my staff page at the University of Adelaide. It's a public page. I wrote that page, right? So, I just don't do, and I'm not going to do things that I'm not proud of. That's just not the way I work. I'm not going to do things that I'm not prepared to disclose to the wider world. Now, these days, I'm separately employed. I've handed over the general managership of Bright New World. I have professional occupation. There'll be work in future that's commercial in confidence, and that's different. I mean, I'm as entitled to a productive career as anyone else. But the way Friends of the Earth have gone about that is, I think it's a tired strategy myself. And I think I bother them so much because they find it difficult to contest the fact that I'm genuine at the end of the day. They find it difficult to contest the fact that I got involved in this because I care about the environment. I also care about people. I disagree with them. It's pretty much as simple as that.
Any good fission reaction produces 2 to 3 neutrons. Give me 2 or 3 people I should invite to speak to on Going Fission.
Ooh, wonderful. Look, I think Professor Jeff Curry is an absolute legend. His job isn't to talk so much about nuclear power production, but what he doesn't know about nuclear medicine isn't worth knowing. And that's an area where Australia actually does incredibly well. He's also a heck of a nice guy. So I'd love the world to get to know Jeff Curry a lot better. Dr. Macy de los Reyes is the chair of the Australian Nuclear Association here in South Australia. She's a wonderful person. She works in radiation protection here, but she is one of the few Australians that has sort of advanced reactor operational experience. She's quite a remarkable person. I'd love to hear more from Macy. And, oh, God, who else? I get to choose one more, do I? You know what? If you could do it, I wonder if you could get leader of the New South Wales National Party, John Barilaro. So he's the Deputy Premier of New South Wales. And he has had a wonderful pragmatic attitude to the fact that Australia needs to be considering nuclear power and particularly the use of small modular reactors. I went to see him speak in Sydney and I was really impressed because he didn't overcook it. I was concerned I was going to find an evangelical politician and I didn't. I found a really pragmatic, calm, and measured politician talking on that topic. So there you go. There's my three: Jeff, Macy, and John Barilaro. See what you can do.
Dr. Ben Hurd, it's been a pleasure to have you on the program.
Logan, thanks, and again, congratulations on this initiative. I'm right behind it.
Thank you.